Bob and I will chat for about 10 minutes or so. We're going to have time for questions. There will be 2 people roaming around with microphones, so think about your questions, and we'll be getting to them soon. Okay, Bob.
Ida.
Well, we're both still practicing clinicians after all these years, and it's really been quite a change. And I think as we look forward, and I know there are medical students in the audience here as well, the doctors who will be taking care of us in the future. And you did talk about this skilling. That is a really important question. But even at the same time that AI de-skills clinicians, colonoscopists, and so forth, it's really upskilling patients. Mm-hmm. I think, as you say, the AI will only be better, so the prompts will be better for patients as well. So there's going to be a different distribution of skills. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about that? Who needs what skills in the coming era?
It's a spectacular question. I think it's to be determined in many ways, but I think that there are trends here that are predictable. This will be a massive force for the democratization of knowledge. I think for better in general, but it will create some tension inevitably. And I think when patients come into the doctor's office and the doctor's not that happy that they have 20 pages of GPT printout, sometimes they see the doctor as being kind of too old school and not accepting of more equality. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's just pragmatic and logistics. It's like, I only have 15 minutes for this visit. We're going to spend the first 10 minutes going through this. I don't know if that's the best use of time. But I think that relationship will have to be renegotiated to some extent. I do think patients, I hope, will be able to do a whole bunch of stuff themselves without having to go see a physician. I think there will be times where we question, do you actually need to see a physician for this, or can you see a less expensive and less well-trained person who is upskilled by AI? So it's not only upskilling the patients, but upskilling other people on the clinical team. Even the colonoscopy, and this pisses off the GI docs when I say this, but if that tool is really perfect in terms of identifying the lesions, you can imagine, you still probably need somebody to push the thing up your rear. Sorry to be indiscreet, but does it need to be a gastroenterologist at that level of training who's making $400,000 a year? Could it be someone, a high school student with really good hand-eye coordination? All questions that we never asked before, but are going to come up as this stuff happens. And I guess the final thing is, I think about life as a generalist, as do you. So I'm a hospitalist. I take care of sick people in the hospital. You take care of mostly patients in the clinic. This upskills me. So I think about OpenEvidence basically as a curbside consultant in my pocket. The kinds of problems that I'm walking around with my patient and I say, oh boy, I hope I run into my favorite infectious disease doc in the cafeteria or my favorite nephrologist in the hallway. I have a question that doesn't need a full consult, but it would be helpful to me. I now instinctively pull out my phone and ask that question. And so everything has to get renegotiated because all of these relationships and board certification and the boundaries of specialties and the boundaries of what patients do and doctors have all been defined in some ways by these expertise gradients that now are going to become very semi-permeable with this technology.
I've certainly been upskilled with OpenEvidence. That curbside ability is really huge.
Do you fully trust it?
I mostly trust it. I do click through, and I think we have Travis here from OpenEvidence, right?
Yeah,
somewhere. Indeed,
yeah.
right? We'll be hearing from him.
I'm getting close, not quite, but I'm getting close to that vigilance challenge, which is remaining vigilant if it's really been helpful and correct 20 times in a row. That happens. The human response is we're lazy. I mean, we know this because in Tesla's, the owner's manual says, this thing we call full self-driving is not autonomous. You must remain vigilant, which is a thing written by a very expensive attorney with a very good sense of humor. Like the idea that this thing you're calling full self-driving, you're going to have to stay awake because you might have a second to react to the fact that you're about to die if you don't slam on the brake. It's just impossible. And so we're going to have to build into these tools if we want the human to remain vigilant. That's in some of that's training, but some of that is system. Like the tool may need to express its level of confidence, or maybe needs to, on purpose, give you the wrong answer periodically so you stay on your toes. You know, just like in TSA gives them images of bombs and guns periodically to stay on their toes. There may be tech meets human interface issues that I think are really interesting and need to be tried and studied.
And CPH is one of those programs that will do that. I'm not sure if it's the first time ever, but it seems like as you talk about the reskilling changes in distribution of skills, that used to be fully within our profession, and now we've got companies that are just starting up, and in a year, they're influencing our practice, the very profession of medicine. How do you think about that, the intersection of sort of what's going on in industry and the Valley here, and what we do at the clinic every day?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, we've always had companies that influenced our practice, you know, from the time in med school that somebody gave me a Littmann stethoscope, that influenced my practice. Obviously, when Epic became our electronic health record, it became a massive influence on our practice. And it's, I guess, unreasonable to believe that it wouldn't be so. You know, what we do is complicated. The stakes are high enough that we need a lot of technology tools, and UCSF and Berkeley are not going to develop those tools by and large. We'll develop some, and we'll develop insights and study them, but they have to be developed by companies because the capital that's required is massive. It does mean that we become increasingly dependent on those tools working and being trustworthy, and the trustworthiness question becomes not just do they work, but are there conflicts of interest embedded in the tools? Now, that's not to malign them too much, because there are conflicts of interest embedded in the way UCSF organizes itself and the way I do my work. We all, have biases and conflicts, but here we're asking companies that have not taken the Hippocratic Oath, don't live under HIPAA, to do things that are really consequential in patient care. That's a little dicey. It raises the question of, do they need to be regulated, and if so, how? I landed in the book, after thinking very hard about sort of regulation, in a pretty sort of light regulatory stance, meaning that at least in healthcare organizations, I think this is moving so fast that efforts to try to have government stay ahead of it are impossible. And I think for an organization like UCSF and our decision to bring in a tool, we're generally so risk averse. We're worried about getting sued. We obviously are worried about hurting people. We're worried about our brand. But I think there are enough internal guardrails that I'm not that worried about that. I think where regulation is going to be super important is, how does a patient have any faith that this tool they're using to get a diagnosis is accurate, is trustworthy, is not, the results aren't colored by a conflict of interest? How do you know that the results that you get from a corporate tool isn't biased by the fact that that company has a relationship with the drug company that was just recommended? All that kind of stuff has to be much more transparent, and I think that has to be forced. I don't think that will necessarily happen naturally. I think one of the big business debates, Julie Adler-Milstein, Sarah Murray, and I have something in JAMA last week on the challenges with Epic and AI, that and really a call for some more push on the EHR vendors, because I do worry. I think, we live in San Francisco, we have this incredibly robust ecosystem around us of these amazing AI companies, venture capital funded, building tools to do everything from draft your note to assist with surgery to help make a diagnosis. But when you talk to the people that make these decisions at UCSF or every healthcare organization that I know of, if you have Epic as your EHR, they will say to you, we're an Epic-first organization. And by that, what they mean is, we'll take a look at some of these third-party tools, but our bias going in is we'd rather use a tool built by our EHR vendor, because we know it'll be automatically integrated into the tool. If Epic upgrades, the tool will get upgraded. We know that Epic's going to be in business in 5 years. We don't have 100% confidence that a startup will be in business in 5 years. There are a lot of reasons, and some of them perfectly reasonable from a business standpoint. We already put down $1 billion to buy Epic, and we've got a good relationship with them. We sort of trust them. So there's a lot of reasons that there's this bias. But that's probably unhealthy. In a market that's this important, you want there to be robust competition. And when I've spoken to people at UCSF and elsewhere who make these purchasing decisions, they will say, if the Epic tool is a B- and a third-party tool is an A, will probably still go with the Epic tool. That's unhealthy, and so it's going to be important to kind of think, and I'm not an Epic conspiracy theorist, and I generally like Epic. I think it won the game because it was the best tool out there. But as a general principle, you don't want that kind of domination. You don't want an entire Epic ecosystem. While you say, you know, if you use Gmail and it links to your Google Docs and it links to your Google Maps and it links to Chrome, that's pretty useful. So there's a reason it's happening. It's not all pernicious and business and all this kind of stuff. Some of it is just sort of logical that the tools might have an advantage if they're auto-integrated. But I think for the entire ecosystem, it's not healthy if these companies that build incredibly good products go out of business, or venture capital doesn't want to put money in them because they say you can't win against Epic. So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that.
Absolutely. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. We do have 2 microphones wandering around. Are there? Here. There's one in the front here. And if you can introduce yourself, be wonderful.
Hi there. I'm Stacey Tinianov, and I am an advocate, patient advocate. Work primarily in oncology, and as you mentioned, the community is eager to have things that help answer questions where there are no answers. And your last slide, you kind of put on the far left side the patient as the novice, and obviously the medical professional as the expert. And I agree with that in so many different ways. However, there's not just health literacy, right? There's this idea of tech literacy. And part of tech literacy is being able to query, ask the right questions, you know, kind of disseminate what you're getting back. And I guess I'm curious from the clinical perspective, from the medical perspective, when you have individuals coming in with those sheets of paper saying, hey, doc, look what I found, and I think it's this. How do you imagine explaining or educating this next generation of physicians on explaining the whole garbage in, garbage out thought process with regard to technology, and also kind of the highly curated, hopefully highly curated base that is in OpenEvidence, for instance, versus what might be in Dr. Google?
Yeah. Well, it's a great set of questions. First of all, I think the diagnosis of the patient in terms of sort of their level of health literacy, not just health literacy, how much they want to get the full story. Do they want to hear really the true prognosis for their cancer or not? Do they want us to talk? You know, it's one of the nuances of being an effective clinician. And so the degree to which we hand over some of that to the technology, I guess there's no fundamental reason the technology couldn't sort some of that out over time, but that's one of the things I worry about. As we think about, will there still be doctors in 10 years? I'm pretty optimistic that there will be, because some of those feel quite human, at least in my thinking about what humans do better than technology today. In terms of sort of, in some ways, digital divide and health literacy and being able to interact with tools, I think that's a problem for the companies and maybe for us as well, which is, you know, the tools really create an opportunity to deliver what patients need based on where the patients are coming from. Meaning that you don't have to know that much tech to put in to answer the question appropriately. And when people ask me, am I worried about a digital divide? Yeah, to some extent. I mean, UCSF can afford to bring in advanced AI tools before a small rural hospital. But if you ask me over a 10-year time horizon, I think this will actually lessen the divides in healthcare, because, you know, for that small rural hospital, their ability to access the information that an oncologist might have or a cardiologist might have, if the only way I can do that is to bring a human doctor there, I think that becomes impossible. Whereas I think these tools create the opportunity to scale information in new ways. I forget, there was one last part of the question. What was the last thing you said? Because I wanted to...
So just curious on kind of thoughts or even guidance for both the clinical professionals, but also the patients on starting to understand the differences of answers achieved by going through ChatGPT or Google versus what they may expect in the clinic through access to something like OpenEvidence?
Well, I have to say that that the answers that I get when I put something in a tool like OpenEvidence, where it's one of its main advantages is the database that it's using as a training set is largely the medical literature and trusted guidelines as opposed to the entire internet. That said, the answers that I get from Gemini and GPT are pretty good these days. I mean, they've gotten much, much better. So I don't think there's a divide there, and maybe Travis will say later whether there will be OpenEvidence for patients. One of the the tool right now is just available to people with a clinician number, but you could see tools like that being rolled out for patients. I don't think the main advantage of a tool like that is the training data set, is that it's training on, I mean, you can always characterize this as OpenEvidence is training on PubMed and, guidelines from the American College of Cardiology, and GPT is training on The Onion and Reddit and, craziness. But I think that's unfair. I think that the data, the answers you get back from the generic generative AI tools are now pretty good, much better than they were a few years ago. But I do think the main advance here is not necessarily going to be the training sets. The main advance here is going to be kind of the sensibility of the tools. Meaning, if the patient wakes up and says, I have a headache, I don't want it giving an answer, because if you said that to a doctor, the doctor would never say, here's what you have. The doctor would say, tell me about it. Are you a headache person? What part of your head? How long has it been going on? Does the bright light hurt your eyes? Does your neck hurt when you bend it? And wouldn't even begin to give an answer until you answered all those questions. So I think the tools have to be much more iterative and in some ways mimic what a good doctor does. And in that also is embedded some sensibility of where the patient is at. And again, I also want to, in some ways, apologize for simplifying the world as novice and expert. A patient obviously is an expert in themselves, knows a hell of a lot more about them, their culture, their history, what's important to them than the doctor does. But from a knowledge context, I think the distinction is useful.
No offense taken. Thank you.
It's another question in the back there as we look forward to upskilling of generative AI to be good clinicians. Next question.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Dan.
Dan Lowenstein, professor of neurology here at UCSF. I want to push you a little bit on your comment that I heard, which was doctors are still going to need to know a lot of stuff. And I certainly agree with you about the Krebs cycle. But
believe it or not everyone does. But okay.
Yeah. But as you know, I taught your daughter about epilepsy when she was a second-year medical student,
Yep.
and I required her to and the rest of the students to memorize the various drugs that are used for different types of seizures. I'm going to stop doing that starting next year.
She still complains about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, she probably doesn't know them anymore. And so what do you think about the hypothesis that the amount of memorization that we're requiring, and I'm just speaking about medical students, but
Yeah.
of course this goes across all education, there's so much cognitive load that we are devoting to that if we could get rid of it, for example, memorizing anti-seizure drugs, which I think is a complete waste of time unless you're an epilepsy expert and you have access to OpenEvidence, that the release of that cognitive load actually would allow us as humans to actually do a better job in many other aspects of medicine, such as compassion, empathy, the discussion you just had about patients, and what do you think about that hypothesis?
I think it's a fair argument, it probably is too simplistic to say nothing can come off the table. I think being very selective, and I think probably more in therapeutics than diagnostics. So therapeutics where we've made the diagnosis and the question is what is the right medication to give, that is a lookup matter. It doesn't strike me that there would be any great advantage in the expert knowing that. But the part I worry about, Dan, is that when you play with these tools, I did this the other day with the New York Times reporter. He was looking over my shoulder as we did a complex case on OpenEvidence. And he was just struck by, I had to know a lot of stuff to know what the next question was. And, did the person ever travel to South America? Therefore now the person's at risk for a whole bunch of weird infections that I wouldn't have thought of. It's that kind of thing. I think it's going to be just important that we be super thoughtful about this And, but the right answer can't be take nothing off the curriculum. And I think therapeutics, where you're confident in the diagnosis, what's the right treatment, you always are going to be able to look that up. And I guess the question I would grapple with there, is there ever a case that you can think of where knowing those things while you were taking the patient's history, it prompted you to ask a question you wouldn't have asked otherwise? And the answer probably is that might come up once in a blue moon, but it probably comes up after you search the med. And in a good search, it says, do you make sure the patient has no history of problems with this other medicine that you didn't know about? That kind of thing. But I think you're absolutely right.
We've got 3 questions.
Good morning. Good morning, Rob. Adnan Alseidi. I'm the Associate Dean for Assessment.
And important to say, like, Dan is the reason this program exists.
Oh, true, yes.
Adnan is the reason that I knew anything about surgery meets AI for my book, so thank you so much.
You're too kind. It's always a pleasure to listen to you talk. I'm going to ask a question that has been on my mind for a while, and that is, if we take these 2 premises you talked about, in the sense that physicians, obviously this has been adopted into healthcare, but physicians now are better with it. And then the other premise that assessment has to be aligned with real-world practice. So are we at a time now that we've basically redefined what a physician is, where basically we're saying a physician is really not just what's in your skull, but it's what's in your skull and your LLM? And if so, then, you know, you've been a chairman for the Board of Internal Medicine. Would you just say, like, should assessments include a large language model? Should you not be assessing the physician by themselves? I mean, I'm in charge of assessment for the medical schools.
Yeah.
Does that mean all the medical students should be actually using LLMs in their assessments? Are we at that stage?
I think you have a hard job to think that through. I think when I was chair, as Catherine was, of the ABIM, we had a hard job, but it was pre-generative AI era. But even then, we moved our assessment from, and the one that most people do now, from a closed book every 10-year test to one where you're answering questions fairly frequently to make sure you're keeping up, and it is now allowed to be open book. I'm guessing the way this probably needs to play out is you defining what the curricular imperatives are at a given time of people's stage of development as they're moving from novice to expert. And there probably is some time in their early curricular development where they need to know and be able to ask the right questions, you know, sort of power through a tough diagnosis without the help of the tool. Because if they don't have that foundational step, they won't use the tools correctly. And then it probably then toggles to now our assessments are real life assessments and use the tools that you'll be using in real practice. I think it's a very hard problem. I think the technology is moving faster than our ability to think through how to manage these assessments. And I have to say, the general issue, which goes beyond even just curricular assessment, of how do we think about the adoption of these tools in the clinical workplace where trainees are coming into the workplace. At UCSF Health, one of the things we recognized a year ago was the committees that were making decisions of do we turn the switch on for drafting a discharge summary or access to AI scribes or access to chart summarization, had no one who was looking at the world through a curricular lens. It was all clinical, operational people. And then we realized that's wrong. In our world, we got to get that right too. We need someone who's going to say, you know, actually, let's turn this thing on for everybody, but not the second-year medical students, because we actually want them to learn how to write a note before the AI drafts the note for them. These are really, they're hard calls in general, but I think now fragmenting the world into a world where they're not quite ready for this tool, and the trainees, of course, will say, what are you doing to me? My senior resident is using this tool, it seems to help them. How can't I can't? These are tough questions. But I think, yeah, I think it's got to be, and the assessment thing is incredibly interesting. The way we assess the AI, people have made the argument that has to become much more like the way we assess a clinician. So did the AI pass a test? Did the AI get it right, you know, in a real live clinical case? I think that's probably an attractive way to think about it. On the other hand, I'm not sure we know how to assess clinicians very well, so the idea that we're going to use that as the model is going to be tricky. So how we assess the AI is going to change as it becomes more, we recognize, can't just assess it in silico and just say, how's it doing by itself? It has to be assessed in the context of a clinical use. And then how we assess the humans has to be assessed in the context of the tools they're going to use. My head explodes as I start thinking about this, and luckily you're going to figure this out for us, so let me know when you do.
Have a question in the back?
Hi, my name is Thomas Tam. I'm an AI researcher in healthcare visiting from Philly. Nice campus here.
Great.
My question is actually about, is there any change that you're seeing in the build versus buy when it comes to like healthcare solution, given the proliferation of AI tools these days?
I think it's a little early, at least in my view, but some of the technology folks will know. But I do think that the general feeling until 6 months ago was, even in a place with these kinds of competencies that we have at UCSF and Berkeley, is still going to not be able to have the money and the technology to build a lot of tools themselves. So, our AI scribe we bought from a company called Abridge. The AI chart summarization is an Epic tool, those sort of things. And yet, there are things that we would do ourselves, like test these tools with our own data, and obviously try to push the frontiers of research and how we use these tools. I think the question of how Claude Code and other kinds of tools that seem to be transforming the world of software development influences organizations like ours, I think to me is something of an open question. There are probably people here who understand that better than I do, but it feels like there's a little bit of a vibe that now maybe we can do some of this ourselves. If there's an advantage of doing it ourselves in that we know our culture, our patient population, we know the kinds of problems that we need to address, I think the advent of tools that allow organizations and individuals to do much more stuff on the coding side than they could do previously probably changes the dynamic at the margin. I don't think it changes the dynamic at the macro. I still think most of the consequential tools that we're going to be using in day-to-day clinical medicine are going to be tools that we buy. And there the big question really is the Epic, your EHR vendor versus a third party, whether it's a third party startup or the Googles and Amazons of the world. I think, but I don't, you probably have thoughts about that. Do you think these tools change things?
I don't
Hold
think
the
it's,
mic a little closer.
yeah, it's not just a vibe coding thing, but as you know, I work on Jupyter Health and open source. I think there's a huge opportunity for an open source ecosystem to intersect with the kinds of technology needs we have in AI and offer a different option than purchasing only on the, the sort of proprietary commercial side. There's an intersection there when open source and industrial and proprietary solutions that I think that will evolve over the next couple of years, and I'm excited. I'm excited for that.
Yeah.
That will come up in one of the later panels, I think, because that's a really important question on the build and versus the buy. We have time for one more question. Is there another question from the audience? I think you had your hand up, so why don't you go next?
So I'll just give a little bit of background.
Say who you are.
My name is Raheel Hassan. I'm a CEO of a AI diagnosis company called WarpX. And we have seen about 125,000 patients where the AI clinically reasons, and then the physician basically is observing as it's going through and interrupts and adds to it as it goes through. What we have been seeing is that there is sort of a plateau that you hit with AI in terms of 92% accurate, a physician accepting it. But to take to the next step, the physician's input as part of the process is really important. For example, the thing you said, have you visited South America, right? That's a question that AI will probably not ask. So for us, at least, our feeling is that unless the physicians cooperate and are part of the process as AI learns, you will sort of hit a plateau. But to convince physicians that they should be learning, they should help AI learn as part of the diagnosis process is a hard sell, right?
Because they're change resistant, or they're worried it'll take their jobs?
Well, the second one, sometimes we see that more often than others. But the other thing also is that it is more of, it has to exactly fit in the timeline that they have. So if they're 15 minutes to see a patient or 5 minutes, you have to adjust it to that point.
Yeah.
So for us, the basic thing is it's easier to have actually that happen in countries like India and other places where physicians are compressed with timelines versus in the US. So my thoughts, I would like to hear from you, what do you actually think that this clinical reasoning data that's not easily available, the questioning part that's not easily retraining, will physicians be open to this period of the next 5, 7, 8 years as AI learns how they reasons? Would they be actually be willing to be part of that process or not really?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think the dynamic of physician fear of job replacement changed with the story I tell in the book is the Jeff Hinton story. In 2016, Jeff Hinton, who's the founding father of generative AI, won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago for it, gave a famous or infamous speech in Toronto, and he said, this is in 2016, he said, we should stop training any new radiologists today because it's clear that within 5 years AI is going to take over this task. And we already have enough radiologists. Medical students are very smart. They read that, and applications for radiology residencies tanked for about 2 years. And then the med students said, about 2 years later, it turns out there are tons of jobs in radiology, and their incomes haven't gone down, and applications skyrocketed again. And today at UCSF, in a town where I take a Waymo, I trust a car that with no driver once a week, at UCSF we can't hire radiologists fast enough. And the radiologists are in some ways begging for more AI to help them do their jobs. So sort of it's easy to kind of believe these tools are so good that they're just going to replace doctors. I think most doctors in primary care welcome AI into their lives because there's probably some vague fear of something happening 10 years from now, 15 years from now, but that's not the way you think today. Today, like I have this problem. There was a study a few years ago that said the average primary care doctor, if all they're doing is prevention that they're supposed to do, that's 27 hours a day. That's if no patient has the gall to actually have something wrong with them. So the job's not doable. So if I'm a primary care doc, I actually want the help of AI to summarize the chart, scribe my note, suggest a diagnosis, and even to take stuff off my plate. And I think the future of primary care is I'm not going to get my cholesterol treated by a doctor. And I don't think I need to be. I think, cholesterol, my Wegovy, my, hypertension treatment, all those sort of things, there's a bunch of stuff that primary care docs do, probably hospitals do, that when you think of it task by task, it could probably be done safely by AI with some triage protocol that says you're violating the norm, you need to see a doctor, and I'll make an appointment for you. And that obviously requires it's embedded in the EHR. I think that's almost inevitable that is going to happen. I actually think that's a good thing. And the final thing I'll say is, as we watch the march of this, and it's a march not only of technology, but of politics, of regulation, of money, et cetera, the Utah experiment is just fascinating. So as you probably know, a San Francisco company actually co-founded by a UCSF surgeon was given permission by the state of Utah 3 months ago to refill medications by itself. And the first thing the company did was went out and bought malpractice insurance because there's no longer a doctor in the loop to sue. It's a list of 400 medications. It's not chemotherapy. It's safer meds. The protocol is if the patient answers yes to a series of questions, then the patient sees a doctor. And I think it's terrific. I think, does any doctor want to see a patient for a refill? No. Does any patient want to have to go and see a doctor to get a refill? No. I think it's the first step as we begin to think about what are the tasks that doctors do, what are the ones that are uniquely in their ballpark that we need to hold on to. I do not want AI telling me I have cancer or that I need surgery. But I actually would be fine with AI treating my cholesterol, and I think we're going to have to figure that out, and I think we will, and I think most doctors will welcome that because the job today is mostly undoable.
So we'll end on that optimistic note that medicine will be a profession we'll be happy to be practicing in 5, 10 years, and I do agree with that.
Don't ask me about 20 years, that's too far, but 5 to 10 years.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks,
That was wonderful. We're going to have a 20-minute break, and then we'll come back for our next panel. Great. Thank you.